Most people would chase away a stray dog stealing food from their store. But when this woman decided to follow him, she uncovered a heartbreaking secret. What she saw changed her forever, and it might change you too. This is the story of a woman, a stray dog, and a truth that will leave you speechless. She thought it was just a hungry dog trying to survive, but when she followed him through the streets, what she found at the end of the trail brought tears to her eyes. This story will make you see stray animals in a whole new light. Lisa had always been a careful business owner. Running a small grocery store in her neighborhood wasn't just about making a living. It was personal. She knew her regular customers, understood their habits, and kept a mental note of her inventory. That's why, when she started noticing food missing from her storage shelves, she knew something wasn't right. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe she had miscalculated her sales. Maybe a customer had forgotten to pay, or her assistant had made an error while restocking. It happens, but as the days passed, the pattern became too strange to ignore. The missing items weren't random. They were always small portions of food. Nothing too obvious, just enough to slip under the radar. A piece of raw meat here, a small loaf of bread there, sometimes even a handful of dog food from the pet supplies section. She asked her assistant, Mark, if he had noticed anything unusual. Not really, he said, scratching his head. Maybe the suppliers messed up the count. Lisa doubted it. The suppliers never made mistakes like this, and she had been running this store long enough to trust her own calculations. Something else was going on. Her gut told her to check the security cameras. That evening, after closing the store, she sat in the small back office, sipping her tea as she scrolled through the footage. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Customers came and went. Mark was at the register, and Lisa could see herself stacking some shelves. Then something caught her eye. A shadow moved near the back entrance, the small service door they often kept slightly ajar for ventilation. Lisa leaned closer to the screen, rewinding the footage. A few seconds later, there it was. A dog, a skinny, scruffy-looking stray had squeezed through the gap and was cautiously making his way toward the storage shelves. He moved with a quiet, almost calculated urgency, his ribs visible beneath his dusty fur. Lisa watched, her heart pounding slightly. The dog didn't rummage through the garbage or knock things over like a desperate scavenger. Instead, he carefully picked up a small piece of meat in his mouth, looked around as if checking for danger, and then, without eating it, hurried back out the way he came. Lisa's eyebrows knitted together. That was odd. Stray dogs were usually driven by hunger, devouring whatever they could find the moment they got the chance. But this one wasn't eating. Where was he taking the food? The next morning, Lisa arrived at the store with a different mindset. She wasn't just running a business anymore. She had a mystery to solve. That day, she paid closer attention to the back entrance. She even left a small piece of food near the door, pretending to be busy with customers while keeping an eye on it. And just as she expected, the stray returned. This time, she got a better look at him. His fur was a dull shade of brown, matted and dirty from life on the streets. His eyes, however, were sharp, full of awareness. He wasn't some mindless scavenger. He had purpose. Lisa watched as he approached the food, sniffed the air, then gently picked it up and disappeared into the alley. Her curiosity burned. Most people would have chased him off, shooed him away like any other nuisance. But Lisa wasn't most people. She needed to know what was going on. The next morning, she made a decision. She was going to follow him. She prepared a small bag of food. Nothing too heavy, just enough to carry easily. She wore comfortable shoes, knowing she might have to walk quite a distance. Then, when the dog showed up at his usual time, she waited. The moment he grabbed his food and trotted off, Lisa slipped out of the store and followed him. The dog moved fast, weaving through narrow streets and slipping into alleyways with the agility of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Lisa had to be careful not to lose sight of him. At one point, he stopped suddenly and glanced over his shoulder. Lisa held her breath, pressing herself against a wall. Had he sensed her? For a moment, the dog stood frozen, as if debating whether it was safe to continue. Then, satisfied that he wasn't being followed, he moved on. Lisa exhaled slowly and continued after him, keeping her distance. Minutes passed. The streets became quieter, the buildings older. They were now deep in the less frequented part of the neighborhood, an area where abandoned buildings stood like silent ghosts of the past. Lisa's heart pounded. Where was he taking the food? Then, just as she turned a corner, she saw it. The dog had stopped in front of an old, broken-down construction site. Rusted metal beams stuck out from the ground, and the remains of a half-built structure loomed in the background. Lisa carefully moved closer. peering through a gap in the fence. The dog was no longer alone. A small, fragile figure lay curled up inside the structure. It was a puppy, thin, weak, barely moving. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The stray she had been following wasn't just stealing food for himself. He was stealing to keep this little one alive. Her chest tightened. The older dog gently placed the food down in front of the puppy and nudged it with his nose. The puppy, barely strong enough to lift its head, licked at the food weakly. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. This dog wasn't a thief. He was a protector, a guardian. Despite his own hunger, despite the harsh life he was living, he had chosen to take care of someone even more vulnerable than himself. And no one had noticed. Lisa clenched her fists. She couldn't just walk away, but she also knew that approaching too fast would scare them. She had seen it before. Strays who had learned that humans weren't always kind. If she moved in too soon, they might run. She needed a plan. That night, she barely slept. The image of the puppy, weak and struggling, haunted her. The older dog, sacrificing his own survival, refusing to abandon the little one. It played over and over in her mind. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She packed a small bag of supplies, food, a blanket, and a shallow bowl for water. When she arrived at the construction site, the dog was already there, curled protectively around the puppy. Lisa knelt a few feet away and placed the food down. She didn't move closer, didn't make a sound. She just waited. Minutes passed. The dog eyed her warily, his body tense, ready to run. But hunger is a powerful thing. Slowly, cautiously, he moved forward. He sniffed the food, then looked at Lisa, as if trying to decide whether she was a threat. Lisa held her breath. Then, to her relief, he grabbed the food and carried it back to the puppy. It was progress. She returned every day, repeating the process. Each time, she sat a little closer. She spoke in soft tones, letting them get used to her presence. It took time, but one evening, as she extended her hand, the older dog hesitated, then, finally, pressed his nose against her palm. Lisa felt tears prick her eyes. He had finally decided to trust her, and that was the moment she knew. She wasn't just feeding them anymore, she was bringing them home. Lisa barely had time to think. The sight in front of her made her chest tighten, an image that would stay with her forever. The stray dog gently placed the small piece of food in front of the fragile puppy. The little one barely had the strength to lift its head, its thin frame trembling with exhaustion. Lisa swallowed hard. She had followed this dog out of curiosity, but she hadn't expected to witness something like this. This wasn't just a hungry stray scavenging for himself. This was something far more heartbreaking. The older dog, despite his own starvation, was taking care of the tiny pup. A question burned in Lisa's mind. Where was the mother? Had something happened to her? Had she been abandoned too? Or worse, had she not survived? Lisa's breath was shaky as she crouched behind the wooden planks, watching the older dog nudge the food closer to the puppy. The pup sniffed it weakly, his small tongue flicking out to taste it. But even as hungry as he must have been, he barely managed a few bites before his head dropped back down. Lisa felt something inside her crack. This wasn't just about hunger anymore. This little one was on the edge of survival. She had to do something, but she knew she couldn't just rush in. The older dog had been cautious around her store, and if she made the wrong move, she could scare him off completely. If he ran, the puppy wouldn't stand a chance. She had to be careful. Step 1, gaining trust. Lisa stayed still, watching quietly. She needed the dog to know she wasn't a threat. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another small piece of food. She placed it gently on the ground in front of her and backed away slightly. Then she waited. The dog didn't react at first. He was too focused on the puppy, watching over him like a guardian. But after a moment, his nose twitched. He sniffed the air, turning his head slightly toward the fresh food Lisa had placed down. A few tense seconds passed. Then, cautiously, the dog stepped forward. Lisa held her breath, keeping completely still. The dog got closer, slowly, hesitantly, then finally picked up the food in his mouth. He didn't eat it. Instead, he turned back toward the puppy and placed it next to him, just like before. Lisa's throat tightened. Even when given the opportunity to eat, he put the puppy first. This dog wasn't just surviving, he was sacrificing. Lisa knew right then that she couldn't walk away. Step 2, observing their situation. Lisa stayed for nearly an hour, watching from a distance. The dog never left the puppy's side. Every few minutes, he would lick the little one's fur, keeping him warm. The puppy shivered, curling into his protector's side. Lisa had seen stray dogs before, but never like this. They were usually independent, fending for themselves. But this dog had refused to leave the weak one behind. He had chosen to protect him, even if it meant going hungry himself. It was clear that they had no one else. The construction site was abandoned, with no shelter other than a few broken boards and scattered debris. If it rained, they would have no protection. If it got colder at night, the puppy wouldn't make it. Lisa's fingers curled into a fist. She couldn't let that happen. Step 3. The first attempt. She knew she needed to act carefully. If she moved too fast, she could scare the dog away. The next morning, before opening her store, she prepared a small backpack with supplies. She packed food, water, a soft blanket, and an old towel. Then, just like before, she followed the dog when he arrived for food. When she reached the construction site, she sat down a few feet away and placed the food and water in front of her. Just like yesterday, the dog looked at her, ears perked, body tense. Lisa spoke in a soft, calm voice. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog didn't move. He was watching her, still uncertain. Lisa stayed patient. She let him take his time. Minutes passed. Then, cautiously, the dog stepped forward. He sniffed the food, looked at Lisa, then carefully grabbed it. Once again, he placed it in front of the puppy first. Lisa smiled slightly. "You're a good boy," she whispered. This time, after the puppy ate a little, the older dog finally took a bite for himself. It was progress. Step 4, the hardest decision. Over the next few days, Lisa returned every morning and every evening. Each time, she brought fresh food and water. Each time, she sat a little closer. The dog started recognizing her. He stopped flinching when she moved. He even let her sit beside him as he ate. But the puppy wasn't improving. Lisa noticed that despite the food, the little one was still weak. He barely moved, and his breathing was shallow. She was running out of time. She had to get them both to safety. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lisa made her move. She had brought a small, open-top box lined with a soft blanket. She placed it near the puppy and then sat down beside the older dog. She let him eat, speaking gently the whole time. Then, ever so carefully, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the puppy's tiny body. He barely reacted, too weak to resist. Lisa's heart pounded. She knew she had to do this right. Slowly, she lifted the puppy and placed him inside the box. The older dog immediately tensed. His eyes locked onto Lisa, and for a second, she thought he might growl or run. But then she spoke softly. "It's okay," she whispered. "I promise." The dog hesitated. Then, to Lisa's surprise, he lowered his head and sniffed the puppy inside the box. He let out a soft whimper. Lisa reached out her hand, palm up, waiting. Then, finally, the dog pressed his nose against her fingers. It was his way of saying, "I trust you." Lisa's throat tightened. She gently picked up the box, cradling the puppy carefully. Then, she turned to the older dog. "Come on, let's go home." She stood up, taking a few slow steps away from the construction site. The dog didn't move at first. He watched her, ears twitching, eyes filled with uncertainty. Lisa turned back and knelt down. She patted her leg softly. "Come with me." A long pause. Then, with one final glance at the place they had called home, the dog stepped forward. He walked beside her. They were going home. Lisa's hands trembled as she knelt before the stray dog. His body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to defend the fragile puppy behind him. His golden brown fur was matted with dirt, his ribs protruding under his thin skin. His eyes, once wary, filled with distrust, were locked onto her every movement. He didn't trust humans. Lisa could see it in the way his ears flicked, the way his paws shifted ever so slightly, preparing to run or fight. And who could blame him? The streets had been cruel. The world had been cruel. And yet, even after everything, he had chosen to protect someone else over himself. Lisa swallowed the lump in her throat. She wasn't here to take anything from him. She wasn't here to hurt them. She was here to give them something they had never truly known. Safety. She placed a fresh meal on the cold ground, soft, tender chicken with a few soaked biscuits. The scent filled the air. The older dog's nose twitched, but he didn't move. Not until Lisa did. Slowly, she backed away, sitting at a comfortable distance, close enough to be present, far enough not to threaten. The dog hesitated, eyes flicking between her and the food. His instincts battled against his hunger. Then, finally, he moved. Not for himself. He nudged the food toward the puppy. Lisa's chest tightened. Even when he was starving, he still put the little one first. The puppy, weak and barely holding on, sniffed the meal and licked at it hesitantly. Lisa could see the struggle in his small, fragile body. He was fighting to stay alive, fighting just as hard as the dog who had protected him. Lisa had made up her mind. They wouldn't last much longer out here. The nights were getting colder, food was scarce, and the puppy, his little body frail and shivering, didn't have the strength to endure it much longer. She needed to bring them home, but first, they had to trust her. Over the next few days, Lisa returned like clockwork. Every morning before she opened her shop, and every evening after closing, she made her way to the abandoned construction site. She never came empty-handed. Food, water, a soft towel to lay on. She didn't force her presence on them. She sat quietly at a distance, letting them decide when they were ready. At first, the older dog remained wary. He would watch her every move, his body positioned between Lisa and the puppy as if shielding him from the unknown. But Lisa was patient. She spoke to them gently, telling them stories of her childhood, of the first dog she had ever loved, of how she had always believed that every animal deserved kindness. Days turned into a week. Then something changed. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the world in golden hues, the dog did something he had never done before. He didn't flinch when Lisa moved closer. He didn't back away when she extended her hand. For the first time, he let her touch him. Her fingers brushed against his fur, rough, unkempt, a roadmap of the hardships he had endured. And that's when she saw them, the scars, thin, faded lines along his legs, across his back, near his ear, some old, some newer. Lisa felt her breath hitch. How many battles had he fought? How many nights had he endured alone, struggling to survive, choosing to protect rather than escape? A tear slipped down Lisa's cheek before she even realized it. She wasn't just looking at a stray dog. She was looking at a survivor, a fighter. And despite everything, despite the cruelty he had faced, he still had love left to give. That night, Lisa made her final decision. She wasn't leaving without them. The next evening, Lisa came prepared. She had brought a small, open-top carrier lined with a soft, warm blanket. She knew the puppy was too weak to walk far, and she didn't want to risk him getting colder. She also brought something else, a leash. It wasn't to trap the older dog. It was to offer him a choice. Lisa sat down as she had done every night before. She placed the food in front of them, but this time, she didn't move away immediately. Instead, she held out the leash, laying it gently on the ground beside her. The dog eyed it, his ears twitching. Lisa's heart pounded. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she whispered. "I just want to help." She reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh, juicy piece of chicken. Not for the puppy this time, for him. She extended her hand, palm open. The dog hesitated. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. His nose brushed against her fingers, his warm breath ghosting over her skin. Then he took the food from her hand. Lisa bit her lip to hold back the emotion. She had won his trust, and in that moment she knew he was ready. With one last glance at the place they had called home, the older dog did something that shattered Lisa's heart in the best possible way. He nudged the puppy gently, then turned to Lisa, and he stepped forward, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of trust. Lisa wiped at her tears, smiling through the lump in her throat. She carefully lifted the puppy into the carrier, making sure he was warm. Then, with slow, steady hands, she picked up the leash and clipped it onto the dog's collar. He didn't resist. He simply looked at her, and then they walked, not as a stray and a stranger, but as something more, as family. That night, Lisa brought them home, and for the first time in their lives, they were safe. They were loved. Max had spent his whole life in survival mode. Every day was a battle against hunger. Every night was a test of endurance against the cold, the dangers lurking in the dark, and the loneliness that pressed against him like an invisible weight. But now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was safe. Lisa had set up a small, cozy bed in her living room. Nothing extravagant, just a soft blanket over a cushion. But to Max, it was more than just a bed. It was the first place he had ever laid down without fear. The first place he had ever been able to close his eyes and rest, truly rest, without the worry of having to wake up and fight for another day. And Benny, the tiny, fragile puppy, who had once been on the brink of starvation, now had warmth, food, and gentle hands caring for him. Lisa had taken him to the vet the very next morning. The little guy had been weak, dangerously so, but with proper care, food, and warmth, the vet was optimistic. "He's a fighter," the vet had said, smiling as Benny let out the tiniest little bark. Lisa had chuckled, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yeah, he is." The days passed, turning into weeks. Healing didn't happen overnight. Max still flinched at sudden movements. The first time Lisa dropped a plate in the kitchen, the loud noise sent him bolting under the table, his whole body trembling. Benny still struggled with his energy levels. Some days, he would bound across the room, playful and curious. Other days, he would curl up in Lisa's lap, too tired to move. But they were healing. Every night, Lisa would sit with them, talking softly, letting them grow used to her presence. She never forced them into anything. She let trust build naturally. She still remembered the first time Max wagged his tail. It had been small, almost hesitant, just a slight movement as he watched her prepare their dinner. But Lisa had noticed. She had dropped everything, crouched down, and whispered, "You're happy, aren't you, buddy?" Max had lowered his head, still shy. But then, slowly, his tail wagged again. Lisa had wiped away a tear. He was learning that food didn't have to be stolen, that warmth didn't have to be earned through struggle, that love wasn't a luxury, it was something he deserved. Benny, on the other hand, was adjusting in his own way. The once timid puppy had started following Lisa everywhere, his tiny paws pattering against the floor as he trailed behind her. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't weak anymore. He was a survivor. One evening, Lisa sat outside on her porch, watching the sunset. Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, his eyes peaceful. Benny was curled up in her lap, snuggled against her sweater. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that Lisa had always loved. She glanced at Max, her fingers running through his fur. "Do you remember, buddy?" she whispered. Max lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. "Do you remember the first time I followed you? How you ran through those streets, carrying food, making sure Benny was okay before you even thought about yourself?" Max didn't understand her words, but he understood her voice. He understood the warmth in her touch. And then he did something that broke Lisa's heart in the best possible way. He leaned forward and licked her hand. Lisa let out a small laugh, tears welling in her eyes. "You're home now," she whispered. "You don't have to fight anymore." Max let out a small sigh, resting his head against her knee. He knew this wasn't just the story of a stray dog. This was the story of a survivor, a fighter, a soul who had been battered by the world, yet still found the strength to love, to protect, to sacrifice. Max could have run. He could have left Benny behind, but he didn't. Even when he was starving, even when his body was weak, he put the little one first. Because that's what love is. Love is sacrifice. Love is resilience. Love is fighting for someone else, even when you have nothing left to give. And sometimes, love is found in the unlikeliest of places. Lisa never considered herself a hero. She was just a woman who owned a small store, living a simple life. But kindness isn't about being a hero. It's about choosing to care. It's about seeing someone in need and deciding that their struggle matters. Max and Benny's story wasn't unique. There were thousands, maybe millions, of animals just like them. Dogs who had been abandoned, puppies left to fend for themselves, strays who had only ever known hunger, cold, and fear. Not all of them had a Lisa. Not all of them had someone to follow them home. But maybe, just maybe, this story could change that. Maybe someone watching this would think twice before ignoring a stray on the street. Maybe someone would choose to feed a hungry animal instead of chasing it away. Maybe in some small way, kindness would ripple outward, one small act at a time. Because at the end of the day, it only takes one moment of kindness to change a life forever. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this.